Hello, welcome to Thursday's English. Here we go. Today you're going to need a pen and pencil, a ruler, you will need a colouring pen or colouring pencil, whichever is fine, and you might want some scrap paper. So pause the video here if you need to go and get those things. Okay, now that we're back, let's have a look at today's lesson. Today we're going to look at relative clauses. So in your book, today's date and title. Today's date is Thursday the 14th of January and the title is Relative Clauses. Today's wills, I'll go through those in a little bit more detail later when we look at the tasks. So if you want to pause here and just make sure your date and title's done, and then we'll move on. Okay, so let's start with some total recall. Let's recap some of our prior learning and see what we can remember. The first question is going to be, is this sentence compound or complex? Because he's so agile, Mr. James is a superb ice skater. Is that a compound or a complex sentence? And then the second question, I'm looking to find an error in speech punctuation. The sentence reads, someone ate my chocolates, Miss Tullett screamed down the corridor, but there's an error in the speech punctuation. Can you find what's missing? Pause here. Okay, ready for some answers? Let's have a look. The first one, the sentence was complex. Because he's so agile, Mr. James is a superb ice skater. Now, the first part of that sentence is the subordinate clause. The second part is the main clause. Subordinate and main make a complex sentence. We know that compound is made of main and main. Now, the second one, we were looking for an error. So the error was missing punctuation at the end of the reported speech. So the speech, someone ate my chocolates, was inside inverted commas. It started with a capital letter, that was all good, but inside the closing inverted commas, there was not a piece of punctuation. In this case, commas appropriate, but sometimes we use full stop, exclamation mark, or question mark. So I hope you did okay on total recall. Let's move on to today's lesson. We are going to start with some recapping though, just to some of the terminology, and I used a little bit of it in total recall. What is a main clause? What do we mean by main clause? Pause here, think about it. What's a main clause? Maybe come up with an example. Okay, so I'm hoping that you are thinking that a main clause is a simple sentence that makes sense on its own. It's that simple subject, verb, object sentence that makes sense on its own, and we can use it as a sentence. So for example, I ate a delicious sandwich. The verb here is ate. The subject of the sentence is I, me, and the object is the sandwich. It makes sense on its own, it's short and snappy, it's a main clause. The second area I want to recap then is one that I used in my previous slide about complex sentences, a subordinate clause. What is a subordinate clause? Pause here and see if you can think of an example and a definition. So subordinate clause is a clause that adds extra information to a sentence. It doesn't make sense on its own. It has to be a clause, so that means it needs to contain that's right, a verb. It's got to have a verb in it. But it can't make sense on its own. So I ate a delicious sandwich, that makes sense on its own. A subordinate clause needs to be joined by a main clause to create a whole sentence. So do you think you could add a subordinate clause onto the main clause that I've already got there? Well, I've done it. Let's see if you've got one like me. I put, while I waited for the bus, I ate a delicious sandwich. So while I waited for the bus is the added clause onto the main part of the sentence. The main part of the sentence is I ate a delicious sandwich. While I waited for the bus is a subordinate clause. It uses a subordinate conjunction. In this case, it's while. And that's that sort of glue that allows us to join it on to the main clause. They're not separate. I waited for the bus. I ate a delicious sandwich. They go together, and it's a subordinate conjunction that joins them together. Today, we're looking at subordinate clauses, but a very specific and special type of subordinate clause, one that modifies the noun or modifies the verb. Okay, it tells us a bit more, usually, about the noun. We're going to be quite focused on the noun modifying type today. Here's an example of a relative clause sentence. Relative clause sentence. The zoo's new Amur leopard that arrived last week was everyone's favourite animal. In this sentence, we are talking about a new leopard being everyone's favourite animal. That's the main clause of the sentence. The main clause of the sentence is that the zoo's new Amur leopard is everyone's favourite animal. The additional information, the relative clause, is that the animal arrived last week. And I've shown you that there by underlining and highlighting that text. That is the relative clause that's been added into the sentence. The main clause is the zoo's new Amur leopard was everyone's favourite animal. That arrived last week is the relative clause, the type of subordinate clause that goes into the sentence to add the extra detail. Now, a relative clause must start with a relative pronoun. It doesn't use the other subordinating conjunctions, things like because, so, as, that we use in other complex sentences. It must use one of the relative pronouns. In this case, it's that, but there are usually a choice of these key 6 ones to choose from. They are who, which, whose, that, where, and when. Who we use when we're talking about a person, because a relative pronoun, I'm going to go back to the last slide actually just to clarify this, a relative pronoun replaces a noun, just like a normal pronoun replaces a noun. So if I wanted to talk about my neighbour Jim wears silly hats, I don't have to use the name, I can replace the name with the pronoun. So I can say my neighbour, he wears silly hats. I've replaced the name Jim with the pronoun he. And we can replace nouns with relative pronouns when we're using relative clauses. So in our example here, we replace the leopard with the relative pronoun that, because if we didn't use a pronoun, we'd end up with the sentence, the zoo's new Amur leopard, the leopard arrived last week, was everyone's favourite animal. And we're repeating that word leopard when we don't need to. We don't want too much repetition in our sentences, so we use these pronouns. Oh, sorry, I'm skipping ahead there, sorry. Who, which, who's, that, where, and when. Talked about who. We use who to replace people. So the man who works at the post office, the man who works at the post office is very kind. Instead of saying the man who works at the post office is very kind, we use who. We use which for objects, animals, things. So in this case, Tina has a bunch of flowers, which his friend bought. We can use whose when we're talking about possessions. So have you seen the girl whose father, cut it off there, whose father works in the cinema? Have you seen the girl whose father works in the cinema? It's talking about the father belonging to the girl, and it uses the word whose, W-H-O-S-E, as a relative pronoun. So if you've got ones coming up about possession today, you want to try and use whose. That, now that and which, quite often we could use either of the two. They're kind of interchangeable. And sometimes it's about just having a go and seeing which one sounds right. In this example, the blue jacket that she's putting on belongs to her friend. It's usually used about objects, things, sometimes animals. Where? Well, that's used to replace places. So the hotel where we slept was excellent. It's talking about the hotel, so it uses the relative pronoun where. When can be a tricky one to use, and it's not always a relative pronoun when we use it. It doesn't always give us a relative clause. That was the day when my sister was born. When my sister was born is the relative clause. So here's a job for you to do. Let's see if we can put this together. Can you find the relative clauses in these sentences? So pause here and find the relative clauses in these sentences. Okay, I'm back. Let's see how we did. The first one. My teacher, who wears weird ties, isn't here today. The sentence is about the teacher. And the relative clause, the added information, is that the teacher wears weird ties. The main clause is, my teacher isn't here today. That's the main information of the sentence. My teacher isn't here today. The added information is that this teacher wears weird ties. So the relative clause is my teacher who wears weird ties. Who wears weird ties is the relative clause. The next one, Bristol, where my uncle lives, is a lively city. The relative clause is where my uncle lives. The main clause is Bristol is a lively city, and we've stuck in the relative clause into the middle there, where my uncle lives. It gives us more information about the city of Bristol. It tells us more about it. Sorry, I didn't do the third one. Let's just go back and finish that third one there. My new scooter that I got for Christmas is broken already. So the main clause is my new scooter is broken already, and I've stuck in the relative clause that I got for Christmas. That's gone into the middle there, and it uses the relative pronoun that I got for Christmas is the relative clause. Now, in those examples, the relative clause was in the middle of the sentence, but it doesn't always have to be. Let's look at this example. Here, the main clause is Josh is an excellent football player. Josh is an excellent football player. That's the main clause of the sentence. Who lives next door is some added information about Josh in a relative clause. Now, where it goes, sometimes there's only one place it can go, or sometimes it's a choice. It's either going to go in the middle or at the end. Let's see it in the middle. Josh, who lives next door, is an excellent football player. Yeah, that works. It gives us the extra information about Josh. It tells us that he lives next door. Can it go at the end? Josh is an excellent football player who lives next door. Yeah, that works as well. And in that case, it's just a matter of choice about where you want to put it. What we can't do is put it at the start. If we put the relative clause at the start, we end up with a sentence, who lives next door, Josh is an excellent football player. It's just not going to work. And relative clauses need to go at the middle or end of a sentence. Now, when we do put them in, we need to be aware of the punctuation required. We need to put commas today either side of the relative clause if we're going in the middle. So in this example, the main clause is Torpoint is a small town in Cornwall. I'm going to pop a relative clause into that spot, and I'm going to use commas either side of it. So the added information on some added information about Torpoint. Let's say where there are 3 schools. Torpoint, where there are 3 schools, is a small town in Cornwall. Now, in this example, it was important that I put the relative clause in the middle. If I were to change that, take this relative clause and move it to the end of the sentence, I get Torpoint is a small town in Cornwall where there are 3 schools. Now my reader's not sure where are these 3 schools. Am I saying that there are 3 schools in Cornwall or 3 schools in Torpoint? It's not entirely clear. So that's an example of where relative clause placement is quite important. Choosing where to put it. In the middle works much better in this example. Right, over to you. I'd like you to have a go at adding a relative clause to a sentence. The main clause here is Toby is an amazing baker. I'd like you to add a relative clause, and you can do this neatly in your book, or if you're not confident you want to have a little go on the scrap paper rather than putting it straight in your book, that's fine as well. You can either put it in the middle, in the pink gap, or you can put it at the end, in the green gap there. Add the relative clause. It's going to be more information about Toby, so which relative pronoun are you going to need to use? Be sure to use the right punctuation. Pause and have a go. Right, I'll have a little go here and put some in. So let's add in here then. I'm going to put mine in the middle. And I'm going to say Toby who went to school with me is an amazing baker. That's my example. So the relative clause here is who went to school with me. That's the added information about Toby. I've put it in between the 2 parts of the main clause, and I've used commas either side of it. That's my complete relative clause sentence. Hopefully you've got one maybe a bit like that, might be completely different, so long as it works as a relative clause sentence and it follows those rules. Okay, task time. Don't go just yet. Just listen to all the tasks. I'll tell you when to get cracking. You're going to choose bronze, silver or gold today. And bronze is where I'm giving you the pieces of the puzzle to construct the sentence, really. I'm giving you the main clause, I'm giving you the relative clause. What you need to do is find the relative pronoun and put it in. So have a very quick look at that. This is the bronze sheet. Here's the main clause on this side here. Oh, it's highlighted both, sorry. The library was closed. That side's got your main clause on it. Now on the other side, you've got the information you need to construct a relative clause. Now, if you'd like to do bronze, but you're still not really certain and you'd like a little bit more support, I'll be showing you a little bit more about bronze if you hang on after I've described all the tasks. Just stay on the video. Silver then is to use simple sentences and add your own relative clause. Silver, your sheet looks a little bit like this. You've just got the main clauses and you need to include your own relative clause to create the full sentence. So if you look at the example, I start with the main clause, the classroom was empty. My added information was that the children sat there. And my complete sentence was the classroom where the children usually sat was empty. You must create full sentences with relative clauses. Okay, don't just fill in the gaps here. I want full sentences with relative clauses, please. Gold, go for it. Gold, you're going to go and create your own sentences with relative clauses. Don't go just yet though. If you get a few sentences in and you're feeling really confident you'd like to try the challenge, I'll be describing the challenge in a bit more detail at the end of the video. So skip ahead once you're ready to the point in the video where you see me back here with a slide about challenge. So if you're bronze and you want a bit more support, stay with me for a little bit more help. Silver, bronze or gold, I'm ready to go. Then pause the video here and get cracking. Okay, so bronze is still with me. Let's have a little look. We can help with a bit of extra support on how to get this job done. So I'm going to have my bronze sheet up to one side over here. Sorry, let's just bring that one down. To the center of the page, and I'm going to bring my own book up here. Ready to go. So in my book, I've got my date and title. I've included the relative pronouns here just to help me construct the sentences. And you could do the same. You could pause the video here and include those in your book. Now, I've done the first one. I used the library was closed and the added information that they visited every Monday. And I included the added information into a relative clause using the right relative pronoun. The library that they visited every Monday was closed. I used the commas either side of the relative clause, capital S to start, full stop to finish. And I'm just getting started on the second one. The second one says, Mr. Hamlin brought around presents. And the added information is that he was dressed as Santa. So before I start here, I might use my scrap paper or just have a little think in my mind. What am I trying to do here? How am I going to put these pieces together? So my main clause is Mr. Hamlin brought around presents. The added information is some more information about him, about Mr. Hamlin the person. That's already telling me my relative pronoun is going to be who. So Mr. Hamlin, who was dressed as Santa, brought around our presents. That sounds pretty good. Mr. Hamlin brought around our presents, who was dressed as Santa. That doesn't sound quite right. Now the presents are dressed like Santa. That's not right. It's going to go in the middle. So Mr. Hamlin, I'm going to write in my book, who was dressed as Santa. I'm going to use a capital letter for Santa. You'll notice I've already used capital letter for Mr. Hamlin. Was dressed as Santa, copying carefully from the sheet, brought around our presents. Now, before I finish there, let's do some sentence essential checks. Capital letter to start. Here's my relative clause. I'm remembering my commas either side, who was dressed as Santa, of my relative clause. And then full stop to finish. Full stop to finish the sentence. Job done. Okay. Third one, you're going to use the restaurant had brilliant desserts and they had been 5 times. So some extra information about the restaurant, that they, whoever they are, have been 5 times. The restaurant, oh, it's about a place. So what's the right relative pronoun? Okay, give it a go, see how you get on. All right, now if you're just coming back and you're looking for the challenge, now is challenge time. So this is the added input for challenge. Now challenge is all about punctuation choices. Relative clauses can be used for parenthesis. We talked about parenthesis before. We talked about it as that added information that we put into sentences. So this means because we're using parenthesis, we've got a choice of 3 punctuation options. We can use commas that we've already used in our lesson today, or we can use brackets or dashes like we normally would when we add parentheses. So the first example, Francesca, who lives at number 6, has a brand new scooter. There I've used brackets, and we've said before that brackets, they usually suggest added information that isn't essential. You don't need it. It's just giving you that sort of extra bit to the sentence. I've put the relative clause in its entirety inside the brackets, and I've made sure that the sentence makes sense without it. The second one, very similar to a lot of the ones that I've done so far today, I've used commas. Number 5, where the Tall family live, is the oldest house on the street. I've used commas either side of the parenthesis because with commas, commas usually bring a little bit more understanding to the sentence. They help to kind of clarify things. Number 5, that's where the Tall family live. It's the oldest house on the street. It's just giving that extra clarity to the sentence. Now dashes, they often denote the most important of parentheses. It's stuff that's added to the sentence, but you've got to know it. So in this case, their garden, which has a swing in it, is the best one around. That's showing that it's the best one around because it's got the swing in it. It's really important to the sentence. You'll notice I've used a dash at the start and a dash at the end because the parenthesis is in the middle. If that parenthesis was going at the end, I'd have the dash, then the relative clause, and then straight to the full stop. We don't go dash full stop. That's another punctuation no-no.